neuroendocrine. It's a big word, but it basically means brain hormones. And I think in year one, you just cover basically three main players in the axis and how they kind of control each other and influence each other. So the main players here are your hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and whatever target organ is in that particular axis. So for example, the most common one you probably hear is the thyroid, right? And this axis is pretty much all set for majority of circuits, where the hypothalamus is your control center. And there's 4 nuclei, which we'll go over, each with different roles. And the command center is your pituitary gland, right? There's 2 parts of the pituitary gland from different tissues, your anterior and your posterior. And we'll go over these acronyms, flat pig and POW, but they basically cover the hormones that these 2 different parts influence. Lastly, like I said, it's a target organ, so it's whatever action center there is, a thyroid, adrenal cortex, or your testes or ovaries for the sex hormones. So we'll just go over them quickly, and we'll revisit this kind of 3-player circuit in a bit. So we'll start off with the hypothalamus. So what is a hypothalamus? Hypothalamus is a part of your brain which basically acts as the control center, right? It basically sends signals to and from the body and brain to keep your body in a state of homeostasis, so balance, right? Right down here, there's 7 functions that it controls, 7 main functions, along with many others. The 7 main functions you got to learn can easily be remembered using this acronym. Big babies should eat, rest, grow, and sleep, right? So body temperature, blood pressure and electrolytes, which come hand in hand because the electrolytes affect the oncotic pressure and therefore how much water is drawn back into the blood. Your stress response, energy metabolism, which is basically how energy is used in your body, reproduction, lactation, growth, and your sleep-wake cycle. All right. These are colored so that they fit into the 4 nuclei that I mentioned before. So you've got your pre-optic nuclear, which just does your body temperature. I kind of try and remember that because, you know, with COVID and everyone kind of testing your temperature, they point the gun between your eyes. So it's pre-optic. Anterior is kind of your exercise energy center. So think when you exercise, your blood pressure rises because there's increased cardiac output. You might get stress response if you get in a pretty tight game of sports or like a good game of tennis. And energy is obviously used to play sports, right? Next is your dorsal medial nucleus. Now this I kind of think of as your kind of baby growth, right? To grow as a baby, obviously to be born as a baby, reproduction is involved, lactation is involved for breastfeeding, and in order to grow, you need to sleep long periods of time, right? So that's what covers the 3 functions of the dorsal medial nuclei. Then you have your posterior hypothalamic nucleus and your mammillary body. Now the posterior is in charge of blood pressure and thermoregulation, like the first 2 nuclei we mentioned, and the mammillary body is directly relevant for sleep-wake cycle. I've got to say though that this kind of information, I think out of the whole presentation today is the most niche, right? It would be a 1-mark question, maybe asking you which nuclei affects what, but because there's a lot of overlap in things, you know, if you're struggling with time, I kind of leave this towards the end. I think the main part of neuroendocrine they want to get you to know is basically the circuits that are available and the idea of homeostasis and positive and negative feedback, which we'll discuss later. Now, the pituitary gland sits right below the hypothalamus and it's physically linked by something called the pituitary stalk, right? Which you can probably see over here. And this diagram has a lot of labels and everything, but all I want you to notice is this blood flow through the anterior pituitary gland, right? And that's relevant because it helps you differentiate how each half is controlled. The anterior pituitary gland is made from glandular tissue, same tissue that developed into your pharynx. Therefore, there's an inflow of blood and an outflow of blood. And blood itself helps carry hormones, right? And therefore, you can use that to kind of remember that the anterior pituitary gland is under hormonal control that acts on the parvocellular neurons, right? The actual the blood flow system is itself called the hypophyseal portal system. And portal just pretty much means a collection of blood vessels, right? You can think of the hepatic portal system, which is used to basically filter all the blood from the venous system in your body. But I'm diverging from the point. Basically, the blood flow means that hormones are used to control the anterior pituitary gland. The posterior, however, develops directly from neuronal tissue, right? And because of that, it's under neuronal control, acting on the magnocellular neurons, right? This is a bit of kind of anatomy, I guess, but helps you kind of remember how each is controlled. I think the most important thing to remember with pituitary gland, however, are the hormones that they influence, right? So like I mentioned before, the two easy acronyms. For anterior, there's flat pig, or some people like flat GP. Well, F and L stand for FSH and LH. Both are important in the menstrual cycle and pregnancy. And they basically influence the uterine and all that to help it prepare for implantation and help the baby develop as well. With ACTH, which is the A, ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, which is your stress response. This would be one of the flat, basically covers the three main axes that you go over. TSH, which I'm sure you've heard before, is a thyroid stimulating hormone, which acts on the thyroid gland. And prolactin, which has its own kind of unique cycle that we'll go over itself, is important in milk production, right? I think of prolactin and production as having the first three letters, so that's how I remember it. And lastly, there's growth hormone, which acts on your bones to help you grow. Now, with your posterior pituitary gland, there are a lot less hormones, thankfully, but I remember it using POW. So P for posterior, A for antidiuretic hormone. And what the antidiuretic hormone does is basically keep water inside your system. And you can remember this by thinking of diuretics, right? Diuretics, they're for blood pressure and they make you pee a lot to reduce the blood pressure. So antidiuretic would mean that you not pee and therefore keep water inside. The second hormone that the posterior pituitary gland is used for is oxytocin, right? And oxytocin is important for milk let down, right? And that means once milk's produced, I think it's released out the nipple, thanks to oxytocin. Other than that, it's also very important for contractions during labor, right? You can actually give IM injections of oxytocin to induce labor if there's a need. So once again, this is, I think, the main gist of the different parts of the pituitary gland, just remembering the hormones that get produced by each. So now we circle back all the way to the three-player diagram that I showed you before. So once again, the hypothalamus is a control center, which actually tends to release a something releasing hormone that then acts on the pituitary gland, which releases something stimulating hormone, right? We'll go over this later on the next slide. And then it'll finally act on the target organ to release your effector hormone, right? So something releasing hormone to something stimulating hormone to whatever hormone that eventually gets released. And I think one more thing to mention about the hypothalamus is that we've also talked about the hormonal control on the anterior pituitary gland and neuronal control on the posterior pituitary gland. But thirdly, there's also hypothalamus is also important for behavior control by the limbic system, right? And this involves the amygdala and memory centers such as the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus, which I'm sure you've heard of. Amygdala itself is for emotions, right? Because it's all part of the limbic system, they kind of interact with each other to kind of affect how you perceive the world and how you react to it. Anyway, back to the three-player axis. there's the HPT axis, which stands for hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, right? Most of these axes are going to be HP something. Like I said, the hypothalamus will release a releasing hormone, which in this case is the thyroid releasing hormone. It's acting on the anterior pituitary gland in this case, which then stimulates TRH and stimulates the pituitary gland to produce thyroid stimulating hormone, which then acts on the thyroid, which in turn will produce the lovely T3 and T4. This has its own actions, but you can notice over here that there is a negative feedback loop that goes to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now, this is what I was talking about in terms of homeostasis. Your body loves to be in that ideal optimal state of balance. And so once a sufficient amount of hormone is produced, in this case thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, and it reaches that optimal level, your body then sends a negative feedback to say, stop producing your releasing hormone and stimulating hormone. We have enough T3 and T4, right? And this is important in keeping that balance. And once you get hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, there's obviously either an excess production of releasing or stimulating hormone, or T3 and T4 itself from any of the three players, or possibly an ineffective negative feedback loop, which will result in hyperthyroidism. The opposite of insufficient TRH or TSH, or possibly resistance to certain signals, would result in hypothyroidism. And this is relevant for any of the axes. So next axis we're going to talk about is the HPA axis, A standing for adrenal cortex or adrenal gland. And this is your stress response, right? So like again, your first hormone here is the cortisol releasing hormone from the hypothalamus acting on the pituitary gland, which unfortunately doesn't release a stimulating hormone by namesake, but releases ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. But it works in the same way. It's stimulating the adrenal gland, which sits on top of the kidney, to release cortisol. Right, and you can see up here, there's the word stress. So stress basically starts the whole cycle. Go back. Stress basically starts the whole cycle. It stimulates the hypothalamus to release CRH. But that's the only thing that's different. There are still two negative feedback loops to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, because once again, your body loves that state of homeostasis, right? So it's essentially the same as the HPT axis, except you're replacing the thyroid with your adrenal gland. Instead of T3 and T4, it's cortisol. Now, your third axis that falls into this three-player mode is the HPG axis. G for gonads, being the organs that produce sex hormones, right? So first of all, like we've seen before, you can gonadotropin releasing hormone. So releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, acts on the pituitary gland, which releases luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, more widely known as LH and FSH, which in turn will help stimulate the production of testosterone from the testes, or estradiol, which is another word for estrogen, and progesterone. And once again, there's that negative feedback loop to the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus to create that balance. So basically, once you remember this three-player structure, it's pretty easy to then remember, what the potential names are in terms of releasing and stimulating hormones, and then just remember the final effector hormones. Okay. Now, the last axis we're going to go over today is the prolactin axis. It's a bit different because, it kind of focuses on the specific pituitary gland and how it's influenced, rather than the hypothalamus and a eventual effector organ. So typically, as you can see, when you're not pregnant or breastfeeding, there's dopamine being secreted onto the anterior pituitary gland. And this inhibits the secretion of prolactin and therefore stops its action. But when you become pregnant or are breastfeeding, the placenta will produce lactogens, which stop this inhibitory dopamine circuit, right? So with less inhibition, there is increased prolactin secretion, which results in increased transport to the brain and after a bunch of things, that basically results in milk production, right? Adding on to this, on the top right over here, you can see number 3 is a suckling stimulus, right? So this adds to the stimulation of prolactin secretion, but instead of being hormonal, you're thinking about more of mechanical stimulation, right? There's mechanical receptors in and around your nipple that get stimulated, and this sends a stimulatory signal all the way up and helps to increase the production of prolactin and therefore milk production, which makes sense because when you're pregnant and breastfeeding, you need to produce milk. Right, it's a little bit different, but hopefully not too complicated, right? And so with the production of milk with prolactin, just remember that milk release or letdown is influenced by oxytocin, which is produced in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, that's all the learning for today, but we'll go into 3 exam style questions, which I'll talk through and kind of explain the answers. Now, so easily mentioned as patient A. Patient A presents to the clinic complaining of recent irritability, missed periods, and loss of her lateral eyebrows. With those 3, you can think about, just give a think about what you think this might be, right? These are not necessarily classic symptoms of this condition, but they are things you might see in a patient, right? You then perform a blood test to assess a thyroid level. You find that TSH is low and T3 and T4 are high, right? So just knowing that T3 and T4 are high means it must be a case of hyperthyroidism. But your next question is, what is causing this, right? There's 3 main players. It can either be the hypothalamus, it can be your anterior pituitary gland, or it can be the thyroid itself. So just give it a think, and think what the levels would be in a normal kind of circuit, and how each hormone would, what levels of each hormone we produce in response to each. All right, you got your thyroid releasing hormone, your TSH, and your T3 and T4. You kind of use that to think about which organ is most likely to cause her symptoms. If you still haven't got the answer, just pause the video. Give yourself how much time you need. This is just more about understanding than anything. So the correct answer should be D, the thyroid. Right? If you notice, the TSH is low in response to T3 and T4, and that's normal, right? Because there's that negative feedback loop. So if it was, say, your pituitary gland that was having the issue, overproducing TSH, you would expect the TSH to be high. Even if it was your hypothalamus producing too much thyroid releasing hormone, your TSH would also be high in response to the high TRH. But because the TSH is low, that means the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are working fine. And the primary producer of T3 and T4 is the reason why there's overproduction of T3 and T4. Right? That's how you can kind of narrow it down to thyroid and not hypothalamus or anterior pituitary gland. C is obviously wrong because POW doesn't have a T in it, doesn't affect the thyroid. Next, we have patient B, right? Patient B, who's 2 weeks postpartum, so she gave birth 2 weeks ago, presents to the clinic after struggling to feed her baby, which is pretty common for a number of reasons, right? However, she reports that her breasts feel full, but no milk was coming out. After examination, you find that the issue is with hormonal signaling in her body. So I got to say, this question is probably something that you maybe might not see in a clinic, right? It's kind of worded in a way to point you towards an answer, which is something I'm sure you'll find out work kind of loves to do, right? Don't think of it, don't overcomplicate it. Just see what information they're giving you, and see what answer kind of fits best to it. So the question here is, what type of tissue is responsible for her symptoms? Is it ductal, glandular, neuronal, or breast? If you haven't got the answer yet, just pause the video until you have a reasonable answer, then keep on going. The answer here should be C, neuronal. This is the reason why. Well, so the patient reports that her breasts feel full, but no milk is coming out. And then I mentioned specifically that the issue is with hormonal signaling. So from that last sentence, you can pretty much cancel out ductal and breast, right? Because those aren't really involved in the hormonal signaling that we know of. So it's either glandular or neuronal. Now this goes back to basically whether it's anterior pituitary gland, which is glandular, or your posterior pituitary gland, which is neuronal. And interestingly, one hormone does milk production, one hormone does milk letdown, and they're in the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, respectively, right? So, is it prolactin or oxytocin? Prolactin is involved in the production of milk, which she doesn't seem to have an issue with because her breasts feel full, but no milk is coming out, which is an issue with letdown. So therefore, the issue is with oxytocin, which is produced in the posterior pituitary gland, which consists of neuronal tissue. Hence, it's C. Last final question is, patient C complains of gaining fat around his face and between his shoulders. He also reports that his skin is very brittle nowadays, right? So gaining fat around your face and getting kind of that like camel hump between your shoulders is very indicative of Cushing's syndrome, which is basically excess glucocorticoids, which are kind of steroids, which most common form would be cortisol, right, in your body. So is having brittle skin. Now, after a few investigations, you are certain that patient is suffering from Cushing's disease. Now, Cushing's disease is a subtype of Cushing syndrome, and specifically is caused by an ACTH secreting pituitary tumor. Now, the question that I'm asking is, what were the results of the test you performed? It's very similar to patient's A question, where you kind of think of the balance of the negative and positive feedback, and think about what an ACTH secreting pituitary tumor might produce. Might help to draw out the diagram. If you haven't got the answer yet, just pause the video. But the answer here is C, right? So there's obviously in these questions where, there's high, low, and there's different options, kind of think about what there must be. So there must be high ACTH, which they all have. Doesn't really help. Then the question is basically comparing the levels of cortisol and CRH, right? If you have high ACTH, you will naturally have a high cortisol level, right? Unless, of course, there's cortisol ACTH resistance in your adrenal cortex. But since, he's showing signs of excess glucocorticoids, you can pretty much assume that he has a high cortisol level, right? And high cortisol levels are in option A and C. So you can narrow it down to that already. Then the next question is, would your CRH, your cortisol releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, be high or low? Well, we've already identified here that the issue is with a pituitary tumor that is secreting ACTH, right? Excess ACTH. So that ideally is the only issue in the cycle. As an example of like overthinking, surely there could also be an issue with the hypothalamus, but in this case, they're trying to ask you to make a decision based on the information they give you, right? So, say everything else is working fine in that cycle, ACTH is overproduced, causing a high level of cortisol, which then has a negative feedback on your hypothalamus, which should result in low cortisol releasing hormone. Hence, the answer is C. Okay, if any of those explanations don't make sense, feel free to post on the Blog3 website or message me, Ben Tang, on Facebook, or just message WS Neuro Soc on our page, and I'll get back to you and hopefully give you a clearer explanation. But thank you for listening. If you haven't done the feedback yet, we'd really appreciate if you could do the feedback for the AM and the PM teachers. This QR code will link you to the AM teachers. This just helps us with our portfolio, and also more importantly, for us when we teach in the future, to maybe what we should include in our PowerPoints. Like I included these 3 exam questions because most people will ask for them. Yeah, just help us to be better teachers in the future and just improve on our teaching and how we can help others. But thanks for your time. Hope you have a great day.